Let's understand the world a little better. With me is Samuel Helfont. He's an associate professor of the Naval War College program with a special focus on international history of the Middle East. Today, we want to understand Iraq a little better. And to dive right in, let me first ask you, what do you think makes the Middle East in general different from the West? What do we have to keep in mind?
Oh, that's a big question. Because I should say that there is a kind of trope that, or a history of overemphasizing the differences between the Middle East and the West, seeing them as this kind of this foreign, faraway, exotic place um, with no real relation to Europe or North America, and that's simply not true, right? So there are differences, but I want to make sure that I'm not falling into that trap, right? A lot of my work has been focused on actually bringing sort of Middle Eastern voices into broader international history and showing how they're actually quite reliable. Um, that being said, obviously the Middle East has been over the past century a place that's experienced a lot of violence, a lot of authoritarianism. You can go down these the UN does a human development report that and the Middle East scores quite low in all sorts of categories, from education to women's empowerment um, to literacy, and that has shaped, unfortunately, the conflicts in the Middle East. Of course, there's a legacy as well of colonialism, and this has sort of brought everything together to make it unfortunately a troubled region. And the people who have lived there, haven't enjoyed many of the same freedoms and opportunities that we have in the West. That being said, there's brilliant scholarship and literature and poetry and even science that comes out of the Middle East. So yes, it's quite different. Um, but on the other hand, we don't want to overemphasize that too much.
Um, I wanted to see how you would answer that question without giving you a guidance in which direction was meant to ask. How about religions, ethnicity, philosophy, traditions, culture, these aspects? What makes um, Middle Eastern people maybe difference in the way they think?
Um, well, sure. I think religion is a huge part of it, especially if we're thinking about Europe, right? Where Europe is really in a kind of you know most of at least Western Europe and parts of North America, I'll say, are really in a kind of post-religious, secular or secularized world. Um, and the Middle East hasn't experienced that yet. If they will, it's open. It's an open question. So religious ideas, Islam in particular, but also if you are among sort of Christian communities, very similar, um, deeply rooted in religious ideas, religious identities, as not just something that is an important part of their life, but something that really shapes their life on a day to day basis in a way that I think is difficult for Westerners to understand. We might enjoy some legacy traditions, of holidays and customs and things like that, but when it comes to making real decisions about your life, about politics, religion plays a much more vital role in the Middle East, particularly Islam. In the Middle East, than it does, I would say, even in the United States. Of course, we have a evangelical streak that runs through our politics, but nowhere to the extent that it dominates the Middle East.
So what does that mean? How I think one part that makes a huge difference with Islam is that they are more the family is more important, I think, than in Western, more individualistic societies. So when decisions have to be made, you will more so uh, talk with your family first, and the whole family kind of makes a decision. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the family does play, I would say, a much more central role in people's lives, and the extended families too, right? I mean, especially once you get outside of urban areas, you have these hamulas, right, which are kind of a clan or tribes, right, which people are very much, is very much a part of their social and political identities in the Middle East, and we don't have anything, similar to that really in the West, but you sort of alluded to maybe has to do with Islam. I'm not sure if it has to do with Islam or not. I mean, uh, there are different traditions in Islam. Some are, quite anti-tribal, uh, and there are other explanations for this, right? So Islam could be part of the mix that leads to this outcome, um, but there are other things too. I mean, the state, the states in the West, right? European states, North American states have tended to be much much stronger, right? People identify with their state. The state is very much in everyone's lives, from education to the decisions you make, taxation. They really play an active role in people's lives, right? You can trust, the state to sort of act on your behalf, right? You can go to a court and get a good, resolution to a problem. In the Middle East, the states have not been traditionally as strong, and because you're lacking that layer, you can't necessarily trust that whatever information you're getting from the state is going to be reliable, right? So you look for other things, like, for example, does this person come from a good family? Right? And if they come from a good family, then maybe you can trust them, right? They might not have a piece of paper that says, "Hey, the state says I'm good, right? I have an education, I don't have a criminal record, I have this passport, and I got it in legitimate ways." Right? Those things aren't necessarily a given in the Middle East. A lot of times you go to school because of family connections you have, right? Or that somebody in the government who's going to help you out, right? They have this whole system of wasta. And so if you don't have these sort of broader frameworks, a lot of times, yeah, it's the family or close kinship networks that you rely on, right? You know that this person comes from a good family, which also means that people have to guard over their family's honor in a way that doesn't necessarily happen in the West as well. Somebody, we sort of criticize people if they're being, punished for the sins of their fathers, right? But in the Middle East, that's sort of just comes with the territory, right? You would expect that someone is going to be punished from coming from a not so
How
great family.
did you call these more tribal? I don't want to butcher the term.
There's all different rules, and they're all different terms, I should say, and they're very, they differ on, you know, depending on time and place. But so you have tribes, you have tribal confederations, you have sort of clans in less rural places, right? So I just threw out the Arabic word hamula for clan, right? But you could use kabila for tribe. I mean, there's all sorts of uh,
That is that is
different words.
common. That is common as one is part of, that everyone is part of some tribe or clan,
It
or is
depends
it?
on the place, right? The more urban you are, the less likely you are to be in some sort of tribe. There are whole, if you go to Cairo, right, and it depends on what. Also, not everybody, not all the cultures are the same. If you go to Istanbul and you ask somebody what their tribe is, I mean, they'll look at you like they won't know what you're talking about, right? um, and even in major cities, people will identify with their family in places like Cairo, right? But it's not necessarily tribal. Once you get out into sort of the countryside, right, and especially in places like the Arabian Peninsula, where it's traditionally a more rural, tribal society, then the tribes play a big role. In Iraq, where I studied, it was it's a mix. In the countryside, you have these clans and tribes, and there's been a lot of migration into the cities, right? So people who come from those areas would still identify. On the other hand, you have a sort of urban, professional class that looks to these tribes, the same way we do, right? As with a little bit of skepticism, that it's a sort of atavistic, activistic feature of their society that they will move beyond, right? So you have different views of this in the Middle East, and really it's dependent on where you are and who you're talking to.
To get to Iraq, what do you think makes Iraq different from the other Middle Eastern countries?
Well, there's a few things. There's some sort of things inherent in Iraq which make it unique, and then there's a history there of the past 30, 40 years, which more than anything make it unique. So the sort of inherent nature of Iraq, it's very similar to Middle Eastern countries in many ways. It's mostly Arabs. There's the Kurds in the north. It's mostly Muslim, although there's always been uh, minorities. It's always been a very big part of Arab and Middle Eastern, politics, which permeates the borders in all in all directions. Um, the few things that make it maybe unique. Every country is unique, right? And Iraq certainly is. It has a potential which has been wasted, but nevertheless was there and it was latent in Iraq, to be a sort of great power in the Middle East, because it combines two things that no other country in the region does. First, it has oil. There's a lot of countries with oil in the Middle East. Iraq is one of the largest producers of oil, has some of the largest oil reserves. Um, but what it has that the other oil producing countries don't have, at least historically, was a large sort of civilizational population center, right? So, I mean, Iraqi history goes back, thousands of years. You have the two rivers, right? Mesopotamia, the Tigris, and Euphrates. It was a center of, in ancient world, it was also a center in what we would call in the West the medieval world. Classical Islam, the Abbasid Empire. Thousand and One Arabian Nights. This is sort of centered around Baghdad, and you had these, opulent caliphs living in palaces with science and literature and all these sorts of things. They were really a sort of center uh, of the world. And as you got into the sort of modern period, they maintained a decent population, at least for that part of the world, the highly urbanized centers like Baghdad and Mosul and Basra. They were trading centers. And so you had this sort of human capital combined with the oil wealth, and they're really the only place that had that. And in the late 1970s and early 1980s, people, if you look back at sort of World Bank or whoever was doing these kind of predictions, they would predict that Iraq is going to emerge as this important power um, in the world, because it combines these two things. Saudi Arabia has all this oil, but they really uh, weren't. They had sparse population, and the people were herdsmen and things like that. Right, there was very few urban centers where you had engineers or educated people, right, that could fill those kinds of roles, right. Libya, same thing, lots of oil. The whole Gulf, Persian Gulf, is sort of, at least the Arab parts of the Persian Gulf are like Saudi Arabia. They were desolate places. The places where you had urban centers with the sort of human capital, they lacked oil, right? Syria, Egypt, for example. And so they just didn't have the material wealth to develop in the way that Iraq had the potential to. So in the 1970s, Iraq was seen, or even going, prior to that, Iraq was seen as a place with a tremendous amount of economic and political potential. Obviously, it didn't happen that way, which is the other way. The other thing that makes Iraq unique is that it's been through 40 years of just horrible warfare, right? I mean, Saddam Hussein comes to power gradually in the 1970s, officially in 1979, and immediately launches a war almost immediately launches a war with his much larger neighbor. And it is, it becomes the Iran-Iraq War. It drags on for 8 years. It's the largest conventional war in between two third world countries, in history. And we're talking about a million casualties, trench warfare, everything you could possibly, chemical weapons. I mean, everything that could happen. He finally sort of extracts the country from that war, only to invade his other neighbor, Kuwait, 2 years later, which then brings them to the sort of center of global politics because America gets involved, and America's trying to shape the post-Cold War, and Iraq becomes a test ground for all sorts of sanctions and no-fly zones, and then, of course, leading into the 2003 war, and all of this. So Iraq, has just been stunted, right? It had this tremendous potential, and then it was just stunted by, horrible 40 years of war and destruction, which have kept the country down. And now it's bogged down simply by corruption, right? The state has never been able to recover. Society has never been able to recover from, not yet at least, from these wars. Some people grabbed control of all the resources and unfortunately have stolen a lot of it. And so Iraq still has this tremendous potential, but it's just not being realized.
Why was Iraq in so many conflicts?
That's a great question, right? There are several different answers that people would give. I mean, people point to colonialism. I don't really think that explains very much. There's a lot of colonial countries. Not all of them were in that sort of that type of conflict. People talk about Iraq as being a kind of artificial state, which is not really true. Iraq was there before Western colonists came. At least the Arab sections of Iraq that run up the Tigris and Euphrates valleys. So the Kurdish section was lumped on after World War I, but the other part, Iraq is actually a quite natural geographic entity. So why was it so violent? I mean, part of this, I think, is just there's an ideological component to this. I mean, Saddam Hussein and the Baathists, they adopted the worst sorts of European politics, right, from the 1930s, which led to all sorts of death and destruction in Europe too, right? So when you have these ideas floating around of, really hardcore nationalism, right, expansionist political ideologies, that's going to usually lead to some not so pleasant results. But the other reason, I think, is you have this combination of this sort of brutal rule, right? Some debates whether it should be called totalitarian or neo-fascist or something like that. But certainly, I think those are debates for a reason. One might look at that country under Saddam Hussein in the 70s and 80s and think about, similar regimes in Europe. But that on itself probably wasn't enough. People could have just ignored it or put it in its box. When you had this kind of regime and it invades its neighbor, Kuwait, in 1990, it happens at this unique moment in global history where the Cold War is coming to an end, right? The Berlin Wall has come down. In fact, they're negotiating German reunification just as the Iraqis are storming across the border into Kuwait in the summer of 1990. And so people are trying to think about, well, what is this new world going to look like, right? What's going to happen now that we don't have a Cold War? The Soviets and the Americans are cooperating. Europe seems to be unifying. There's a tremendous tremendous possibilities in the world, right? Even China, even though it didn't happen at the time, there was Tiananmen Square. People sort of thought that maybe it's going in that direction, right? Elsewhere in Africa, you have the apartheid regime, which is falling apart. It seems like things are moving in a good, in the right direction, at least for more idealistic statesmen and intellectuals around the world. And then you have this regime in Baghdad, which is torturing people and murdering folks, and it's used chemical weapons not only against its enemies but its own people, and then it invades this sovereign country to its south, Kuwait, and it's just mayhem. They're just raping and pillaging, and we use those words, raping and pillaging, as those that just roll off the tongue in English. But we're talking about real raping and real pillaging, right? I mean, the literal definition of those words. And this is just an affront to this wave of global idealism, and the U.S. decides to make make Iraq into a test case, right? To show the world that sort of politics isn't going to be. Now, there's a lot of hypocrisy in what the U.S. is doing, right? Don't get me wrong. The U.S. isn't some noble, it has a lot of noble characteristics, in my opinion, but it's not it's certainly not perfect, and it has made all sorts of its own, mistakes, and it's responsible for its own tragedies. That being said, there were people who thought, I think, realistically or legitimately felt that they could move on to something better, and they decided to make an example out of Iraq, right? To reverse what the Iraqis did in Kuwait, but not just that, to show that they could use certain new tools, sanctions, no-fly zones, UN's weapons inspections. There had always been sanctions, right, as a tool of statecraft, but this is something different. This was the entire UN coming. These weren't American sanctions on Iraq, right? They were UN sanctions on Iraq, right? Where the UN comes and says the global community will not stand for this, and according to the rule of law, we're going to impose these sanctions in these no-fly zones and these weapons inspections, and we expect you Iraqis to to come clean about these different aspects of your past. And so they built this entire sort of system partly to contain Iraq, but partly just to show that they could do this, right? That this was a tool in sort of towards world order that could be used in the future. And the real idealists out there, people, and there were some, not necessarily in government, but in NGOs and different humanitarian organizations, were hoping that they could develop something that would be even an alternative to warfare completely, right? There is that narrative that's going on in the early 1990s. And you have groups like Human Rights Watch working with like the Defense Intelligence Agency on these the American Defense Intelligence Agency on these shared projects, which is, the lion laying down with the lamb, I guess. But so because Iraq is put in this role and it becomes this test case, when things start to not go well, there's just too much at stake, right? The U.S. can't just walk away. And so the U.S. realizes things aren't going well. Its allies realize things aren't going well. You have people start defecting from this idea of holding Iraq responsible, because actually, and these tools turn out to be not so idealistic, right? When you sanction an entire country and it turns out that people have trouble getting medicine and they have trouble getting food, and there's kids dying, who are innocent, and there's all of these innocent people who are suffering, especially if someone like Saddam Hussein in there who doesn't care about the suffering of his own people. He'll just let them rot if it'll put pressure on the U.S. to end the sanctions. So the humanitarian situation in Iraq is getting very bad. There's a sort of just people get tired of the issue of Iraq, and so the coalition starts to fracture at the UN. It's not going the way the U.S. wanted, but the U.S. can't walk away, right? When Somalia went bad, a few people were shot in Mogadishu around the same time. The U.S. just said, "Okay, we're out of here," right? They could, intervene in the Balkans. They could not intervene in the Balkans. There's a lot of geopolitical reasons to do so or not do so, but they weren't trapped in the same way that they were in Iraq. Because if they walk away from Iraq, they're giving up not just on Iraq, but of this entire, at least American politicians. If you read, the transcripts of like the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton was having with Chirac, right? Jacques Chirac, the French president in the late 1990s, and Chirac is saying, "What are we doing here? This isn't making any sense, right?" But Clinton would respond, "Okay, but then what happens next if we walk away from this? If we say that Iraq doesn't have to follow these rules, right? The rule of law, then the rule of law means nothing, and we're back to the rule of the jungle, which is, this is the language that they used, right? It's the rule of law versus the rule of the jungle. And we're going to show that the rule of law can work in Iraq. And there's a fear that if they let it slip, that the precedent will be set, that international law means nothing, and we're back to the rule of the jungle, where states just do what they can, right? They take whatever they want, as long, power is the only arbiter."
And after that, Saddam was still ruling. Would you say? I think one of your points was that Saddam was a major, not a catalyst, but a one of the major reasons why Iraq went into trouble again and again and again. Is that just it, or what else is there? I don't. Was really just Saddam's rule the problem?
I mean, listen, it's never just one person, right? But I think he is a big part of it. This is someone who
Yes.
pretty single handedly, decided to launch two major wars against his neighbors. At least encouraged certain behaviors within his regime, which are quite extreme. With using chemical weapons and stuff like that against your own people. There's only a few rulers in the 20th century who've done something, or the second half of the 20th century, because that have um, done something like that. But of course, like I said, I don't think that those things on their own were going to be enough to lead to post 1990, everything that we've seen. It's this combination of that type of ruler in this type of age, right? This type of really liberal age. And when you have a power like the United States who wants to impose a kind of, you can call it all sorts of things, liberal hegemony or liberal imperialism, or if you're being nice, just the liberal world order. And we have to mention, there's a strange um, a, a strange international moment where the U.S. doesn't really have many competitors. Um, Russia is out, right? They're down and out. China hasn't risen yet, and the U.S. has this enormous amount of enormous arsenal and enormous resources at its disposal, like 30% of the world GDP or whatever it was. Um, and they have nowhere, there's nowhere tying that down, right? So they can, American policymakers and strategists feel like they can sort of go on and fix problems which probably would be minor problems. I mean, if something like Iraq were to rear its head today in the Middle East, the U.S. is too busy with China and Russia to spend too much time worrying about this, right? It would take some minor actions. It would try to, um, you know, uh, it would try to achieve its interest or reverse whatever bad things had happened, but it would also not let itself get sucked in to a 30-year conflict in a country uh, like Iraq today, because it has bigger problems. Well, it didn't have bigger problems in the early 1990s, right? There was really nothing on the Americans' plate uh, to tie them down or to make them, to distract them, or draw their resources away from trying to handle what could be considered not a minor issue, but a middling issue, right? In world politics.
How many conflicts or wars were there under Saddam's rule? Do you know that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends on what you call a war, right? There's certainly, you have well, in the 1970s, there's some internal conflicts, right, with the Kurds. So it maybe called like a civil war, right? There was
Mm.
also some insurgencies in the late 1970s among the Shia in the south. Saddam comes from a Sunni Arab background, and but the majority of Iraqis are Shia Arabs, so a different sect. And there was an uprising in the south that sort of um, it had predated, but it really gained steam from the Iranian Revolution next door, which is also a Shia revolution. And so you have those insurgencies, and then you have the big war, right? The Iran-Iraq War. That goes on for 8 years. That, I mean, by anybody's definition, is a war. That's huge, right? There's air power, there's naval battles, there's everything you can imagine. And then you have a brief 2-year respite before Iraq invades Kuwait, right? And then you have Kuwait and the Gulf War, which again, everyone sort of recognizes there's a war there. A lot of people, I think, in the West, then, if you ask people who aren't necessarily, experts on this period of history, the average person, they think, okay, there was a war in 1991, and then there was a war in 2003. But actually, there was a war almost continuously uh, throughout that time, because the U.S. and its allies, Britain and France at first, and then France drops out, but late in the 1990s, they put these no-fly zones over southern and northern Iraq, and Saddam challenges them in numerous cases, right? So, 1993, there's a brief attack. There's almost a major confrontation in 1994, which is sort of in the last minute uh, um, solved, right? In 1996, there's a major operation by the U.S. and the British against Iraq because of the Iraqis getting there's a lot of conflict here, right? So, like, the Kurds getting their own civil war after 1991. The Iraqi Kurds are fighting each other. The Ba'athist regime under Saddam intervenes in this Kurdish civil war, and the U.S. attempts to go in to protect the Kurds. It's even more complicated than that, but I won't I won't get down into the weeds. And then in 1998, when Saddam kicks out these weapons inspectors, or suspends their access to places, which is basically the same thing, there's a major confrontation. The U.S. calls it Operation Desert Fox. At the time, it was the largest confrontation, the largest military operation that the U.S. had since the Gulf War, right? So in 1998, the largest confrontation that the U.S. had since the Gulf War was another operation in Iraq. After that is over, there's another 8 months when, we're talking about like 1,000 airstrikes or something like that occur in Iraq in 1999. And then, this just keeps on going until we get to 2003. So there's almost a constant stream of violence throughout the 1990s that people don't really, I would say most people, even people who are sort of aware of history and security or American military history, don't understand that the war didn't end at the end of the Gulf War. It just continued. And it continued straight into 2003. And the same issues that we were talking about in 2003 were issues that weren't resolved in the Gulf War.
There were also many conflicts beside the U.S. conflicts you also just mentioned. What I think many of them were started by Iraq, if I understood that right. And what were the motives for most of them?
So you mean internally to Iraq, or?
No, Iraq, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, for
Oh yeah, so
example.
most of these were yes, again, it started by Iraq. The Iran-Iraq War, I don't want to defend Saddam Hussein because what he did was wrong and bad. But there were both there were some defensive reasons for that conflict too, right? Part of it was just him being a kind of expansionist, pseudo totalitarian dictator, doing what expansionist pseudo totalitarian dictators do, which is invade their neighbors. But there were other things too. So in 1979, there is a revolution in Iran, right? This Islamic revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini comes to power. Um, these Iranian revolutionaries weren't satisfied with Iran. They were at least at the beginning, right? This is tempered over time, but at least at the beginning, they were looking at expanding this revolution across the world. Tehran was going to be the first capital to fall, but not the last. And they were going to have this Islamic revolution that was going to be a wave across the Middle East. The obvious next target was Iraq, because you have Saddam, who is this kind of, he's not a military dictator, but he's something akin to that, a secular-ish military dictator, we could call it. Certainly not an Islamist, certainly not ruling on behalf of Islam. And he's also a Sunni Arab, which is a minority in the country. The majority are these Shia in the south, which border Iran and are from the same sect as the Iranian revolutionaries, the Shia. So the idea is, hey, we just had this revolution to overthrow the Shah, which is a kind of monarchy in Saudi in Iran. Let's just do the same for the next secular ruler in Iraq, right? And the majority will rise up and overthrow him. And they're doing this, and they're expanding into this revolution into Iraq. There's even some shelling across the border, right? And Saddam sees this as a threat, right? He also sees that the Iranian regime is in a bit of chaos, right? Because the military officers, the pilots, people like that, they were a lot of them were purged during the revolution. So we thought, they're weak, and also they're attacking us. This is a great opportunity. We can go and we can win this very easily and protect our interests, even gain some more interest, because there's some, Iran is it's ruled by Persians, but there's a lot of different peoples in Iran. And one of them on the border is with Iraq are Arabs. And there's actually a lot of oil in that district as well. So Saddam thought, we can really quickly take this territory. They're Arabs like us. We can incorporate them into our sort of Arab, state. And by the way, they have a lot of oil, and this will solve the problem of the Iranians attacking us as well. So he has offensive and defensive reasons for launching that war. Saddam also, he comes his party, right? He's part of this Ba'ath Party, this called Renaissance Party, I guess you could call it. And this party believed that all Arabs should be united into a single state, right? So that there shouldn't be these different states: Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. That they're all one Arab state. And it was the colonialists and imperialists that came in and divided them, and the Baathists were going to put the whole thing back together into a state. So invading another territory and incorporating those Arabs into your state, you could see it a little bit like Bismarck. This is how some people have looked at Saddam during that period, that he's an Arab Bismarck, right? Going to unite the like Bismarck, unites the Germans. He's going to unite the Arabs. Kuwait is something a little bit different. I think we have a fairly good sense of what was going through Saddam's thinking in 1980 when he invades Kuwait. It's all these Iran, when he invades Iran, when and they're all the reasons I just mentioned, right? Kuwait is a little bit different. We sort of know a lot of pieces of the puzzle. A lot of ingredients, but we don't really have a smoking gun of him saying, "This is why I'm doing it." So the pieces of the puzzle, or the ingredients, or whatever you want to call them, are that one, the Iraqis are out of money. They spent all of their money during the Iran-Iraq War, and they have a lot of oil, but at this point, oil prices are quite low. So Kuwait had loaned Iraq a lot of money during the Iran-Iraq War to pay for it, because Kuwait has like 40% Shia population and a Sunni monarchy. They were also a target of the Iranian revolutionaries. The monarchy also felt threatened. And them and the other Gulf Arabs helped fund the Iran-Iraq War, helped fund the Iraqis for that reason. Now Saddam said, "Hey, we just fought, we just lost hundreds of thousands of people, basically not fighting for Iraq, but fighting for all of us, fighting for all of us here that were threatened by this regime next door." So the idea that you're asking for that money back, go ask the mothers of the slain soldiers, right? For the money back. This isn't fair. Those should be grants. And the Kuwaitis said, "Nope, we want our money." And so the Iraqis were quite upset with the Kuwaitis for that. They also, these OPEC countries with the oil, everyone cheats, right? There's always an incentive to sort of sell more oil, because if everyone sells less oil, the price will stay high, right?
Mm.
But everyone says, "Well, if I'm the only one selling, it's the free rider problem, I guess you could call it, right? If I sell my oil, if I secretly sell more than I'm supposed to, I'll get the money at that high level, right? But if everybody does it, then the price goes down and everybody loses, right? And so these countries are always fighting this dilemma, and the Iraqis are blaming Kuwait for selling too much oil and driving down the price of oil. The Iraqis also just
Mm.
didn't like the Kuwaitis, right? I mentioned earlier that the Iraq is this kind of civilizational center. You have Baghdad, which was it's Babylon, right? I mean, so you have Mesopotamia and Babylon and Baghdad and this rich history there. And Kuwait was one of the poorest, most backward countries economically in the world into the mid 20th century when they find all this oil, right? And the Iraqis, and this is the Iraqi view again, not my view, right? I don't want to come off of this, but certainly Saddam talked about this, right? Saddam, we have his voice recordings where
Mhm.
he had a lot of his meetings, and he talks about the Kuwaitis, which was a common view in Iraq at this time, as being this kind of nouveau riche. They like their sports cars and their drugs and their prostitutes, but they're not really like that. Well, who are these backward people? He's looked at them as kind of camel herders that just came into a lot of money and used it to buy Lamborghinis and cocaine. Um,
The new
and
rich.
so really, huh? What did you say?
Like the new rich, and
Yeah,
he's
the new
over
rich, right?
there.
So he's like, that's how Saddam looked at them, right? He really looked down upon them and said, and he thought that Kuwait and Iraqis, not just Saddam, most rulers of modern Iraq since it became independent, thought that Kuwait should have been part of Iraq. They thought that Kuwait, if you look at old maps of the Ottoman Empire, Kuwait is part of Iraq. And it has all this oil. It also has access to the sea. Iraq doesn't really have access to the sea. Um, it has this one little peninsula that sticks out, this Fall Peninsula, but it's a marshy kind of mud flat, so you can't get big ships in there, right? There's no deep water port in Iraq. Kuwait has a giant, huge harbor with a big bay there, and you can get ships in. And so, Kuwait has access to the sea. It has all this. It has all this oil. And historically, it had been part of Iraq. The Iraqis blamed British imperialists for just kind of cutting it off to harm Iraq. And then finally, the Iraqis realized there's some new research by someone named Daniel Shardell, who just finished his PhD at Harvard, is now a postdoc at Yale. And he's really pointed and looked back in Iraqi sources and said, they were also talking about the end of the Cold War. And the Iraqis saw that, hey, they had been protected by the Soviet Union for decades. But now that the Soviet Union's gone, it's going to be these pro-American forces that sort of shape the new Middle East, and it's going to come at Iraq's expense. And so this is Iraq's last chance to sort of, get ahead of that trend, to shape things in its own interest before, the power of the United States and its allies in the region just becomes overwhelming, and the Iraqis are left on the outside, sort of looking in. So they have all these sort of mixed things together, right? That they want to bring Arabs together, right? This Bismarck idea, and there are Arabs after the invasion who say that this is just what Bismarck did, right? And,
Really?
invading, right? And
Arabs from Iraq or
no, also other Arabs in the region.
okay.
Other Arab nationalists, right? Because the Arab nationalists didn't really like a lot of the Arab nationalists didn't really like these Gulf monarchies.
Mm.
They Arab nationalists, they wanted to be modern, right? They wanted to build modern states, similar to the way that exists in Europe, right, with education and science and technology and engineering. They wanted to get beyond any of this old tribalism and sometimes even old what they looked at as more traditional manifestations of religion. Um, and they saw these monarchies in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia as deeply conservative, religious, sort of stuck in time, and an impediment to building a better Middle East. And so that Saddam was going to go clobber one of them and take it over and incorporate it into this new Arab state, hopefully the first of many. There were people who were saying that.
To get to current times, who would you say are the major allies from Iraq or of Iraq?
So Iraq is in um, an interesting situation in terms of allies. It has many and none, I guess you could say, um, because you know because of all these wars, especially the 2003 war, which really just imploded the country, right? I mean, everything, the economy, the state, the military, everything just imploded. And it drew in all of these outside powers to sort of fill that vacuum, right? So the United States is in there, of course, is occupying power. The Iranians are in there. A lot of the Gulf countries like the Saudis, they don't want the Iranians to win in Iraq, so they are in there trying to oppose the Iranians. In the north, where these Kurds are, in Turkey, they also have their own Kurdish population and their own problems with their own Kurdish population. Um, and so the Kurds are very involved in what's happening in Iraq because they don't want to see certain types of Kurds take power, and they certainly don't want to see an independent Kurdish state. And so Iraq just kind of drew in all of these different places from all these different states, from outside of their own country, right? So you have the Iranians, the Americans, the Gulf Arabs, especially the Saudis and Turkey in the north, um, and they're all there, and everybody sort of recognizes the reality of that, and that there's no way um, to expel your adversaries. So the United States and Iran really has, at times it's been almost a proxy war that has been waged inside of Iraq, right, between Iranians and Americans. You might remember a few years ago, the killing of Qasem Soleimani, right? There's also there's still Americans there, and there were missile barrages and mortar barrages on American bases by Iranian um, backed forces. All sorts of stuff back and forth. That being said, so the Americans really don't like the Iranians. The Iranians really don't like the Americans, but they're both there, and every time they have to get a new leader, a new prime minister, and everyone recognizes that you have to have someone who's going to be on good terms with both sides, right? So the Americans, even though they wouldn't want this prime minister, they would love for an Iraqi prime minister to come in and just expel the Iranians and expel the Iranian forces, but they realize that's impossible, right? There's no way that's going to happen. The Iranians would love the Iraqis to just expel the Americans, right? Get rid of them, but they also realize that's probably not going to happen because the Americans, bring all sorts of aid and security benefits that the Iranians simply can't compete with, right? And if they try to rely on the Iranians, it's not going to be as bright a future as it could be. And so everyone, you know, has their enemies, and a few buildings down, a few embassies over, and everyone sort of understands, that there's going to have to be, whoever's ruling Iraq needs to be on good terms with all these different sides. So it has all of these, friends, but none of them are really truly Iraq's friends, right? They
Mm.
all have their own interests that they're trying to achieve in Iraq, and sometimes at the expense of the Iraqis. So that's their situation.
What would you say are currently the biggest problems that Iraq faces?
So one, I think, is I'll say that there's two. One, I think most people would agree, and almost all the Iraqis would agree. The other one, I'll go out on a limb and you would certainly get some pushback on this. I'll reveal my cards as a partisan, but so the first one is just corruption. I mean, it's they have a huge amount of oil and resources. They have people. They have universities. If you had, but you can't do anything in Iraq without paying people off, right? All the money it's just evaporating, right? Billions and billions of dollars are just evaporating into the bank accounts of corrupt officials. If you want to be a policeman in Iraq, you have to pay a lot of money to, illegally pay kickbacks to the person who's hiring you, right? And how do you get that? Well, you go to the shops and it's almost like a mafia type of deal. If you want protection from the police, you better pay us extra, right? And then this money just basically gets drained out of the Iraqi economy and into the pockets of these corrupt officials. And it's up to, if you're working in the oil ministry, I mean, that money is just, unfortunately, not going to any good. So that's the number one, the number one issue. Number two, where again, you call me biased, right?
I'm
sure there
excited.
will be people who point out that I work at the Naval Postgraduate School in the United States, but or the Naval War College. But Iran is a huge issue, right? The United States has its own interest in Iraq, and it's trying. It does do things sometimes which aren't in the best interest of the Iraqis for American security. Sure. But in the end of the day, I think the United States would like to see a strong, prosperous Iraq, right? Democratic, prosperous Iraq. The Iranians are less benevolent, and they're in there for their own interest. There are a lot less concerns for them about human rights, about democracy, about liberalism, about developing the Iraqi economy, right? And they rule through a quite authoritarian tactics, and that's always going to be a problem for Iraq as long as those Iranian forces are in the country. A lot of them have their own militias that are well armed and are outside of the legal system of Iraq, where they can basically do whatever they want, and you can't arrest them because they have guns. Sometimes more guns than the government, and that's never a good situation. And a lot of those militias don't report to Baghdad; they report to Tehran. There are Iraqi militias made up of Iraqis, but who are loyal to and get their financing through Iran, and that's always going to just be a disaster, right? So with the fear of looking too jingoistic or nationalistic or something like that, or pro-American, which I think a lot of my scholarship is very critical of American foreign policy, especially in Iraq over the past 30 years. But that Iranian problem is going to continue to hold the Iraqis back.
You have to look out for your microphone on
Sorry about that.
on your hoodie again. No, it's all good. From problems getting to opportunities.
Yes.
I mean, you kind of touched upon it with U.S. Support, but other than that, what opportunities do you see for Iraq?
Okay, so again, there's oil, there are people, educated population, that itself, and a young population. So prior to COVID, there was a kind of Arab Spring in 2019, 2020 in Iraq, where people came out onto the streets and they were protesting, and for all the right reasons. They were sort of tearing down these symbols of Iranian power. They weren't necessarily pro-American, but they weren't necessarily anti-American either. But they were certainly coming out against this sort of nefarious influence that Iran has in their country, and they were looking to finally deal with this. Right? I mean, a lot of the age of the average Iraqi is quite young. The majority of people weren't alive in 2003.
Mm.
So they don't remember all of this history that wasn't their lived um, experience. And so you do have this political force of the youth, which seems to be, what seems to want something better. They have these resources, and they do have, their position in the Middle East geopolitically is a blessing and a curse. They are surrounded by all these other states who have, who are in their country, right, and have a lot of influence in their country, but which means they're also, deeply connected
Mm.
to all parts of the region in a way that doesn't exist elsewhere, right? If you want to do business with the Saudis and the Iranians, Baghdad might be the only, one of the few capitals where you can actually do that, right? And if you include the Americans, right? So maybe Doha, they try to be pretty neutral, or Muscat and Oman tries to be pretty neutral. But Iraq, I mean, you really have a strong presence and decent relations with the Americans, with Europeans, with Turks, with other Arab states, and with the Iranians. And there are optimistic Iraqis. If you talk to optimistic Iraqi politicians, they'll tell you that being in this sort of central location, it's been a curse, but it can also be a blessing, because they can use that to. Yeah.
So the location slash relations, and also what you before that mentioned, the educated population plus the oil. But those two things weren't sufficient before that, right? I mean, they had those, let alone the last thing, but they had those two first things before that, the oil and the
Yes.
education. Well, nothing happened, right?
Yeah. It's not this is not destiny, right? This is just
Yeah. So how? What would they need to be? What would they need to change so it
well,
works?
I mean, I think number one, the thing that they need to change is the issue of they have to figure out a way to dial back this corruption. I
Hmm.
would say to eliminate corruption, that's going to be impossible. I mean, it's
So
so.
it goes all against corrupt. That's
I mean,
the thing
so
hindering
that's
them.
the number one issue I think in Iraq,
Okay.
because they have so much money. I mean, we're not talking about like, um, you know, we're not talking about like a minor boost. I mean, we're talking about like billions and billions of dollars, right? I mean, uh, the entire GDP of other countries in the region, or elsewhere in the world, is being squandered every year, by just evaporating into this system of corrupt officials. I mean, we're talking about one of the world's largest oil producers. I mean, look, you don't want to make any good comparison. I wouldn't want to make any good comparisons with Russia, right? But look what Russia is able to do, right? Sanctioned by so much of the world, but they're able to hold on because of they just have so much gas and oil that they're selling
Hmm.
still. And they're getting through war, right? I mean, I think their GDP actually went up last year, or something crazy like that, right? I mean, Iraq is in a very similar situation, much smaller country than Russia, but similar levels of natural resources, right? Look at the neighboring states. If you go to Dubai, I mean, Dubai doesn't, it's not oil, but yes, you go to UAE or Doha, and you look at these, these sort of futuristic skylines, right? And they have these sovereign wealth funds, and they're, you know, uh, there's just a tremendous amount of wealth in those countries. Iraq has a similar, amount of oil. If they could develop it and use it, in the right way, there is an immense potential there. But the number one reason that they're not is this corruption. And then two, I mean, it's repeating the same things I already said, but developing their country is going to take building of a state, democracy, all that sort. Or it'd be nice to have a democracy, but something, some sort of legitimate state with rule, and that's not going to happen when you have these militias running around and you have Iranians who are in their country up to no good. Um, So dealing with those issues would be the key. I mean, I don't say it's impossible, right? I think it's certainly possible, but nothing is destiny, right? I mean, if a new strong ruler came in like Saddam and you know started invading people again or building up the military, doing those, yeah, then nothing good's going to come of that. Um, you know,
But you see Iraq's future rather positive.
I wouldn't say that. I would say that
No.
there's a chance.
Okay, there's a chance.
There's a chance, right? If I had to bet, I wouldn't say that it's probably going to go in a good direction. I don't think they're going to be able to deal
Hmm.
um, with a lot of these issues. Uh, I wish they could. Yeah, I wish the best. If it was up to me, they would do wonderful. Uh, but um, but those are huge hurdles to get. I mean, you really have to refashion whole parts of the state and society and the way that it functions.
I would like to quickly go about over your job as a historian,
Yes.
um, and ask you, in particular for Iraq, what
Yeah.
would you say are the best sources to inform and learn about the country, to inform oneself and learn about the country?
Okay. So Iraq is a unique situation for historians of this sort of modern period, right? Uh, 20th and 21st century. Um, so there's no open archives. A few things are open in Arab states. Jordan has a few archives open, but really that like something that like a Western European country would have or the United States would have, where after a certain number of years you can go into the archives and you can see what the politicians were doing, right? That doesn't exist anywhere in the Middle East except for Iraq. Um, and only for a brief period of time of Saddam Hussein's presidency. Because in Saddam Hussein's presidency ended in 2003 in this war, and the U.S. military and some Iraqi dissidents, they went and just gathered up all of the documents from that regime. Particularly, there was a group of dissidents who were working sort of hand in hand with the military. They claim to be independent, but I think it's very clear that they were working with the Department of Defense. And they went and took the entire Ba'ath Party archive of the Ba'ath Party secretariat in Baghdad. And they first kept it in Iraq, then they moved it out of Iraq because they thought it was too dangerous to keep it in Iraq. Eventually, the documents went back to Iraq, but digital files, digital copies of those, we're talking 10, 11 million pages, still exist and are available to scholars through the Hoover Library and Archives at Stanford University. And this is the only records that we have of this type of any regime, of any Arab state in the modern period. So it's fascinating. You can look inside, you can see what they were doing. When the U.S. military went in and took records, they also took like the presidential office. So Saddam used to tape record his meetings. I think I mentioned it at some point. So we have thousands of hours of him sitting around the table with his advisors and other people that are on this revolutionary command council, which ruled the country. And there's table talk between them about what they think, how they see the world, all sorts of stuff. And then they come to decisions, and then you can look in the Ba'ath Party files and see how those decisions were implemented. You can see what the intelligence service was doing, inside of Iraq. You can see what, a lot of things that they were doing outside of Iraq. You can see, how they thought about the world. A lot of the ways that things that we thought we knew about Saddam, things that were sort of assumptions going into the American invasion in 2003, turned out not to be the case, right? It was a very closed regime. And people were kind of guessing, trying to read tea leaves and get little sniffs of things and finding things out. So, for example, everyone thought that, not everyone, but academics and policymakers in the United States tended to think that Saddam was the kind of source of sectarian strife in the country, that he was a Sunni ruling over this multi-sectarian and multi-ethnic country. He was a Sunni Arab. And as things got tough, he, sort of looked inward and became a sectarian ruler, ruling on behalf of this Sunni Arab sect, which is like 30% of the population. Um, and that he sort of fanned the flames of sectarianism in order to keep himself in power, from, that his sect would keep him there. Uh, it turns out that wasn't the case at all. Saddam wasn't, he did rely on his people and his sort of kinship networks and people from around his town and his family members, which were Sunni Arabs. That's certainly the case. And Sunni Arabs were the elite of that country for, a couple hundred years. So it makes sense that they were, people in leadership positions. But he did not like sectarianism. He saw sectarianism as a threat. Rather than as something as a positive. And he spent a tremendous amount of time and effort fighting sectarianism, both among his own Sunni populations and the Shia population, right? And so his regime turned out to be a kind of bulwark against sectarianism. Now the U.S. thought, right, that he was creating the sectarianism. So if you go in and you invade a country and you overthrow the person you think is causing the sectarianism, you think that you've solved the problem, right? Well, if it turns out that person isn't causing it, but they're the ones preventing it, and you overthrow the main impediment to sectarianism in the country, then you have a problem on your hands, which is what happened. And so, we really have this inside look, but we don't have that anywhere else. So they're amazing documents. It's a super unique set. Other than that, the Middle East is plagued with horrible, at least in the Arab countries, are plagued with just not that many archival documents. So you rely on all sorts of other things: newspapers, memoirs, oral histories, but these all turn out to be quite unreliable. Iraq is, for a good 20, 30-year period, really the 80s and 90s into the 70s a little bit, we can actually do real archival research in a modern Arab state and learn all sorts of things about state-society relations, sex, religion, things that you just can't get anywhere else, really. So it's an
Yeah,
exciting country to study in that sense.
and that's basically what your work looks like going through these papers, taking notes. Is that mainly it?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, of
Hmm,
course, it's,
interesting.
historians. It's one thing to have something in an archive, but you need to sort of cross-reference it with other archives, right? So, or oral histories or newspapers, right? So something's in an archive, great. You have an archival document, right? But what
Meaning,
is
is it
it?
really true? Like looking over
It
it is
it
if there
could
are
be.
other sources
Yes,
or
it's, I mean, all things have their truth, even if it is true, even if it's not, I mean, in the most crude cases you could have something that is forged or something like that, right? But even if it's not forged, I mean, if you read the documents of a small cell of 12, 13 people, they might produce a lot of documents, and you read their records, and they seem like a big deal, right? And they are a big deal to themselves, but they're not really a big deal according to anybody else. They're only 12 or 15 people, and so you can't only rely on those types of records, right? So you look at those records. So Iraq has several different types of archives, right? I mentioned, there's these ones that the military took. There's these Ba'ath Party records. There's memoirs. But then you look at, like, especially for my last book, when I was looking at Iraq and sort of global history, its role in global history and international relations, um, I would look through the UN archives, right? UN debates. Um, what were the Iraqis saying? And how does that line up with what we're seeing elsewhere? What are the products of that, right? So, or we'll see what the Iraqis were doing in a place like France or Germany or United States. Well, you look at American records or British records, right? And you see, like, do they have some sort of impact? Sometimes you have a ruler who makes a decree, right? Or and then no one follows it, right? So then, how important is? I mean, we had this in our country, even, under the last president. Trump would say something, and everyone would say, well, we're not doing that. We don't care what you say in your tweet or whatever, and so it's really not as important as a real policy memo that comes down, and is executed across the government. And so you have to basically, do that. But it's difficult work. especially these Ba'ath Party archives, they're not well organized.
Hmm.
There's also problems with personal information. That it was a kind of police state, so it collected personal information about people, their own kept files on people, and sometimes it had not nice things to say, or you don't want to say that this neighbor, or Germany had this issue after the Stasi files came out, right? This neighbor was spying on that neighbor, and all that. How do you deal with this? And so they actually keep uh, quite severe security restrictions on these documents. Anyone can go use them. You have to sign this document saying what you can disclose and what you won't, right? Personal information. You can't disclose personal information about somebody who is not a regime official, a government official, just some ordinary person living their lives. You can talk about them. You just can't say Ahmed at this house in Baghdad. You can
Okay.
say an
Yeah.
Iraqi did this, um,
You
but
can you can say, meaning you who
the historian.
reads the historian, but
Yeah,
in the files the name is mentioned, right?
that's right. Right.
Okay.
So, if
And
it's somebody
who can
that
see them, or who can go
anybody can
through
go
these?
and see
And
them, right? You have to
okay.
sign a paper when you go in saying, I won't do this, right? I won't out somebody who's just a normal citizen going about their business, right? I can say an Iraqi, I can say a Sunni Arab in this town, I can say, upper class person or lower. I just can't say this person's name at this, right? So you have that. And because they are worried about this, they don't let you take any photos or copies of these records. Um,
So you have to stay in the library, in
you have to
the.
stay in the archive for months, and just read through them and take notes on your laptop, or write down notes or whatever it is, right? And so you just sit there, and it really takes months and months and months. And you have to go back over and over and over again, and just sit there. And like I said, they're not well organized, right? So sometimes you're reading through like these binders. It's 1,000 pages, and it had mentioned one thing you need on page 652, and you just read 1,000 pages of Arabic, and you got one little fact that was useful. Other times you open a binder, and it's 700 pages of everything that you could ever want, and it's wonderful, and it's just too much even, right? um, but part of it's fun. It's digging through. It's like, I feel like it's somewhere between, like, Facebook scrolling or Twitter scrolling, right? Because you're always looking for the next sort of hit of serotonin to find something. But it's also like fishing, right? If you're like, you're out
Mm.
there, you're just out there, and then like once a day, boom, yeah, something, something. Here it is. Like, I found something, right? The rest of the day, you're just sitting there, not doing anything. That's kind of what it's like. You read and you read and you read and you read and you read. You don't find anything. You read, and boom, all of a sudden you find 50 pages of some amazing story that's going to make your project.
Is that also what you would do if you were to, let's say, I would give you a new country. I would say, a country you knew almost nothing about, let's say, the Congo or
Yeah.
Mongolia. Is that how you would start your process, like going right into the archives and then just reading as much as you can?
No, I would start by reading the secondary literature. What is, I don't really know what's going on in the Congo. I mean, I kind of have
Okay,
some
then maybe
basic.
not the Congo.
Right. No, but like, I would go and see first of all, what have other people found, right? You really want to go through the secondary literature first, because also you could go and find something in the archive. Oh, this is great, and you spend all your time, following this thread of material. But then it turns out that somebody just did this project 5 years ago, and you're just repeating what
Somewhere
they
else.
did, and it's a sort of waste of time. So, you really want to read the secondary literature first, see what's out there, and this will help you, because if you kind of know what other people are arguing, and then you get into the archive, and in the ideal situation, you find some documents that tell a different story,
Mm.
that dispute what somebody is saying. So, we always thought it was X, Y, and Z, but it turns out it's not. It's A, B, and C. And we thought the president was worried about this, or we thought people in this state, interacted in some way, but it turns out that they don't. And so that's really interesting, right? And we can tell, that, or we find something that just doesn't exist anywhere else, right? So, in this last project, this last book, my first book I did. Um, when I was in the archives, and I came across this group called the Iraqi Ba'ath Party outside of Iraq, right? And what it was is these different Ba'ath parties and these diaspora populations around the world that they had set up. And so, for example, there was an Iraqi Ba'ath party in the United States. It was sort of covert and clandestine. It was run out of the embassy, or actually was run out of the Iraqi embassy at the UN in New York. And they had, something like 60 something branches of these different Ba'ath parties around the world. Um, no one knew anything about them, right? And so it's just a completely unknown entity, right? And they play an important role in Iraqi foreign policy, and they're thinking about the world and their own strategies and international relations, but no one had ever heard of it. And so that was really interesting, right? But you have to know the secondary literature to know, whether or not someone's actually heard about this organization, right? If
Mm.
I came and said, "Oh, there was this really interesting organization called the Stasi," in in Germany, everyone would go, "Okay, fine, that's great. We know about the Stasi. You're not really adding much to the conversation here, right?" So you have to know kind of what the landscape is before you go in. And then you go in and you find, you find your stories, and you find, what you think is happening. But really immersing yourselves in the archives is something you have to do at some point. But like I said, some countries don't have archives, right? I mean, they have archives, but you can't get in them, right?
Mm, mm,
And so, you end up, looking through media, and a lot of places, most places, when you have archives, you can take pictures, and so it becomes a different problem of, with these Ba'athist archives, for example. um, I really have to be careful about what I'm writing and what I'm not, because you don't have that much time. I mean, even if you have months, you can't just copy the whole thing. So you have to be discerning. I'm gonna, okay, this is something important. I'm gonna write this down, right? And I'm gonna take the time to take notes here. And these other things, I'm not gonna worry about them, and I'll just keep moving. Versus, for example, in the U.S. Library of Congress, they have newspaper archives, right? They have Iraqi newspaper archives, and they have a thumb drive, and you can put a thumb drive in this machine, and it's on microfilm. So the newspapers come across this microfilm, and they have a thumb drive, and anytime you come across an article you want, you just press this button, and it downloads it right onto your thumb drive. Sounds really convenient, right? Except for the fact is, when you get home, you probably have like 1,500 articles, and now you have to really kind of go through them. And so a lot of times you end up taking just way too much material. Even at at regular archives, for example, I went through the papers of Boutros Boutros-Ghali, who was the UN Secretary General during the 1990s. And, I probably took 4,000 pictures of these different papers, right? Because there was just so much useful stuff in there, and you're allowed to take pictures. So why not? It's just one more click, and then you have to go home, and really it takes forever to you're almost doing it twice.
mm.
So yeah,
Can
so
imagine.
that's basically one of the problems.
We're already in overtime,
Oh, okay.
but I would quickly would want to go to the second segment, which is just a quick round of rapid fire questions
Okay.
I have prepared for you. So for that, please try to answer in 2 to 3 sentences, roundabout,
Yes.
and yeah, I will start. If you had a big poster, let's say on Times Square, everybody would see it. What would you write on
Buy my book.
it? Which is
And which is my latest book is Iraq Against the World, Saddam, America, and the Post-Cold War Order.
that's a good message. Um, okay, next one. Do you have a favorite quote?
Ooh, do I have a favorite quote? I don't know that I have a favorite quote, but I will say that the book, the title is a quote from a speech that George H.W. Bush gave on September 11th, 1990, when he announced the policy for the Gulf War, that the U.S. is going to get involved. And he said, "This is not Iraq against America. This is Iraq against the world." And now you can go online and see September 11th, and he announces a new world order in this speech. So you can go on the internet, and you can find things about September 11th, New World Order, and all sorts of conspiracies, even things about your COVID shot pop up in there. So,
A controversial opinion, I believe what nobody else does.
ooh, nobody else does. Boy, that's putting that in controversial
Almost,
opinions. I got plenty
almost
of those.
nobody.
I've already said some. I think America has actually been a force for good over the last few years in Iraq. Anyway, not in general. America wants what's best for Iraq. I'll say now. Maybe not in the past, but now America wants what's best for Iraq, which is in danger of looking too nationalist and jingoistic. But there, I said it.
Um, what would you have liked to know earlier or when you started?
Earlier, I would have liked to know um, that I enjoy education and reading, and that there's actually a future in that. I spent a lot of time thinking that wasn't possible, and I went on all these different adventures as a young person, and sometimes down the wrong road. And so yeah.
What's your newest, biggest insight?
My newest, biggest insight, boy. My newest, biggest insight is that you can't control who your children are. I think you can. And so I have two boys, and they're both in elementary school, and you find out that they're going to be who they want to be, and you have very little control over this.
um, what is your personal opinion of Saddam Hussein?
He was a pretty horrible person. Um, I think if you read about him enough, you can empathize with some of his problems, with some of the way he saw the world. And you begin to almost see the world through his eyes and sort of respect it. And then you have to shake it off and say, "Oh no, this is bad. This guy's not good." But yeah, horrible person.
How would you spend $10 billion to make Iraq a better place?
Oof. The problem they have is not money. um, uh, I guess I would look for uh, um, young young people who are not corrupt, who want to do the right thing, and try to set them on a path, give them the education and the resources that they need to succeed.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Samuel Helfont. Iraq Against the World is his book, his newest. If you want to know more about his opinions, about his research of Iraq, is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't?
No, I think you've hit almost all of it.
Anything else you want to add? You want to mention? You want to promote? Anything you want to say?
Thanks for having me. That's probably the only thing I haven't said yet.
Well, thank you for being here. It was a pleasure.
All right. Thanks so much.